160 boots hit the pavement at the exact same moment. Nobody on that sidewalk moved. Nobody breathed. An old man sat on a stool surrounded by the wreckage of something that had taken 53 years to become what it was. The drunk man who destroyed it stood frozen in the center of a closing circle, understanding for the first time what genuine fear feels like. Phones went up and then came down, because what happened next was not what anyone expected. Not the officer with his hand on his radio, not the woman who had stopped recording, not the drunk man who had just made the worst decision of his life. What 160 Hells Angels did for a veteran on a Flagstaff sidewalk that afternoon had nothing to do with violence, and everything to do with what it means to be a man. The high desert heat of Flagstaff, Arizona, settled differently than the punishing furnace of the lowland cities. Here, at nearly 7,000 feet above sea level, late July afternoons arrived wrapped in a dry, pine-scented breeze that moved off the surrounding ponderosa forests and swept clean through downtown with a kind of steady generosity. The sky above Route 66 on this particular Saturday was the blue of deep water, cloudless and vast, the kind of sky that made a person feel simultaneously small and clarified, as if the altitude had thinned not just the air, but every unnecessary thing. Ethan Caldwell had been playing the corner of LaRue Street and Route 66 every Saturday afternoon for 11 years. He arrived at 1:47 p.m. and never left before 4:30. In between, he played guitar for anyone who happened to pass, and for several people who did not slow down at all, and for the intersection itself, which he had come to believe deserved a soundtrack. He set up his stool first, a folding camp chair, black aluminum worn at the joints, and then placed the guitar case on the sidewalk in front of him, lid open, the faded red velvet inside curled at the edges from years of sun. He tuned the guitar with the unhurried concentration of a man who understood that preparation was not separate from the work, but was, in fact, the beginning of it. Each string received the same attention, the same careful turn of the peg, the same moment of listening before moving on. The guitar was a 1967 Gibson J45. At 68 years old, Ethan's hands carried the evidence of a life lived physically, the knuckles enlarged, the skin toughened and mapped with fine lines, the veins visible along the backs like small rivers under leather. His face was the face of someone who had spent decades outdoors, creased at the eyes and mouth with the kind of lines that came from both weather and expression, from squinting into sun, and from laughing, and from the particular muscular effort of holding things together when everything around you was coming apart. He wore a faded olive-drab army jacket despite the warmth, the left breast bearing a patch of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagle, and below it, small and precise, a combat infantryman badge. He had earned both in Vietnam. Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry Regiment, deployed in early 1969, returned in late 1970. Ethan did not talk about those years to strangers, and he had trained himself to think about them only in certain contexts, when the VA sent its letters, when the calendar turned to certain dates, and when he played. Music had been his constant since before the army. He had grown up in rural Tennessee, the son of a tobacco farmer who played fiddle on Sunday evenings, and by the time he was drafted at 19, he could play guitar well enough that the men in his platoon requested songs at night in whatever encampment they occupied. It was, his sergeant had once told him, the most valuable skill a soldier could have, not because it helped with survival, but because it made survival worth continuing to do. The guitar came later. Spring of 1971, 3 days before Charlie Company scattered to their respective home states, 8 men pooled the last of their separation pay and found a second-hand Gibson in a pawnshop outside Fort Campbell, Kentucky. They presented it to Ethan over eggs and coffee at a diner booth, with a hand-scrawled card signed by all of them. For the guy who kept us sane. Don't stop playing. He had not stopped. Not in 53 years. 7 of those 8 signatures were gone now. Natural causes, mostly, but not all. The decade after Vietnam had been merciless to the men of Charlie Company in ways the jungle itself had not managed. Roy Hendricks, gone to a bottle by 1979. Pete Rafferty, a heart attack at 52. The others following in their own ways and their own times, each one leaving a smaller number of people in the world who shared the particular private knowledge of what Charlie Company had been and done and endured. Ethan caught himself. He did not do this on the corner. On the corner he played. He moved through Gentle on My Mind first, an old Glenn Campbell arrangement that had the right tempo for early afternoon, unhurried and without demand. A pair of tourists stopped briefly, listened for a verse, nodded approval and moved on. A woman with a stroller dropped a dollar bill that the wind immediately attempted to steal back. Ethan pinned it with his boot, without missing a note. The corner of LaRue and Route 66 was one of those geographical coincidences that accumulates meaning over time. The famous highway had carried the breadth of American experience through this spot for nearly a century. Depression-era families heading west, post-war travelers chasing the horizon, beatniks and dreamers, and desperate people and joyful people, all of them leaving some invisible deposit in the asphalt and the air. The downtown storefronts had changed. The neon had been replaced or renovated, but the road itself remained, and something in the atmosphere of that intersection still remembered all the people who had passed through it. It was, Ethan had always felt, a good place to play. He had noticed the motorcycles when he arrived. The lot beside the Rusty Spur Saloon, a block east, was full of them, and not merely full. The bikes extended out of the lot and down the adjacent side street, in row after gleaming row, substantial and deliberate in the afternoon light. He had counted what he could see from his corner and stopped at 60, aware that there were more beyond his sightline. A group that large meant an organized ride. Charity runs came through Flagstaff regularly, following the Route 66 corridor with the same seasonal reliability as the monsoon rains. But the cuts the riders wore told a more specific story. The patch on the back of each leather vest was the kind that a person either recognized or did not. Ethan recognized it. He watched the riders the way he watched most things in his 68th year, without alarm and without assumption. He had lived long enough and seen enough of what human beings were actually capable of in extreme circumstances to have retired from the practice of judging by appearance. He turned back to his playing. He was 3 bars into an original composition, a slow, finger-picked piece in a minor key that he had never titled, when the noise on the sidewalk changed character. Not louder, exactly. Different in a way that he felt before he heard. The particular shift in the ambient sound of a public space when something has happened that no one has quite processed yet. He looked up. The door of the Rusty Spur Saloon had swung open, and a man was standing in the afternoon light as though the brightness itself had caught him off guard. Ethan watched, his fingers still on the strings, and he did not yet know what he was watching. He only knew, with the quiet instinct of a man who had learned to read situations before they declared themselves, that the afternoon had just changed. Caleb Morrow had been drinking since 7:14 in the morning. This was not a fact he could have stated precisely at the moment he pushed through the door of the Rusty Spur Saloon at 3:30, but it was precise nonetheless. He knew the time because he had checked his phone when he opened the first can. A habit, or perhaps a form of self-documentation, as if some diminishing part of him was still keeping a record of how far down he was going. A witness to his own collapse, unable to intervene. 7:14. A Saturday morning in Flagstaff. 8 months earlier, Caleb Morrow had been Staff Sergeant Caleb Morrow, United States Army 3rd Infantry Division. By every official metric, he had been a competent soldier, a leader who performed under extreme pressure with remarkable composure. His final evaluation read: he had led a 12-man squad through 3 combat rotations in Afghanistan, had received a Bronze Star for actions during a firefight in Kandahar province in the fall of 2021, and had boarded a flight home in November of that year with the same physical body he had arrived with and an entirely different interior. The interior was what nobody in the official documentation had found a way to account for. He had come home to a 2-bedroom apartment in Flagstaff, to his wife Amanda and their 3-year-old daughter Lily, and he had tried with genuine effort to be the person they needed him to be. He had tried for 4 months. The trying had looked from the outside like something else entirely, like withdrawal, like volatility, like a man who had decided that the life he had returned to was somehow insufficient. Amanda had described it to him in their last real conversation, before the last real conversation ended without resolution. She said he was like a man standing in a room filling with water who refused to acknowledge the water. That he kept insisting everything was fine, that the room was fine, that she was the one misreading things right up until the water touched the ceiling. She had taken Lily and moved back to her parents' house in Tucson in April. The job at a local construction company had ended in June. Not formally terminated, he had simply stopped arriving with the regularity that employment requires. And eventually, the company had made an administrative decision that required no formal announcement. Caleb stepped out of the Rusty Spur saloon, and the afternoon light hit him with a force that felt personal. The street was bright and full of people moving through Saturday with an ease he could no longer simulate. He stood on the sidewalk, and the foot traffic divided around him like water around a rock, and something that had been building in his chest for weeks, for months, since November, since long before November, pressed against the inside of his sternum with a weight he had no word for and no mechanism to release. Then he heard the guitar. He turned toward it. An old man on a stool, army jacket, playing something slow and quiet. The sound reached through the noise of the street and landed, for just a fraction of a second, somewhere clean, somewhere below the months, below the pressure, somewhere that was still intact. Then he saw the patch, the Screaming Eagle, 101st Airborne Division. And something entirely different took hold of him. The 101st had been in Kandahar. He knew men from the 101st. He knew what had happened to them there and what happened after, and the specific way the country processed the army's processing of its veterans, which was to say, it mostly didn't. It sent them home with pamphlets and phone numbers and final evaluations that described their composure under pressure. And then the country moved on, and the men were left standing in apartments and on sidewalks, trying to find their footing in a world that had not paused and did not intend to. The 101st patch on that old jacket was connected, directly and immediately, to every piece of pressure in his chest, and the connection made the pressure worse, and the alcohol turned it lateral, redirected it outward instead of inward, which was dangerous in a way that Caleb, in that moment, could not assess, because the assessment required a level of clarity he no longer had access to. He walked toward the old man. "Hey," he said. His voice came out thicker than he intended, roughened by hours of drinking and the dry Arizona air. "Hey, old-timer." Ethan looked up from his playing. His expression was calm, unhurried, the look of a man who had encountered interruptions before and found them manageable. "Good afternoon," Ethan said. "You gonna sit here all day playing that thing?" "That's the plan," Ethan said, and his fingers moved back toward the strings. "People are trying to walk here." Caleb gestured at the sidewalk around him, at the pedestrians who were, in observable fact, moving around them both without visible difficulty. "There's room," Ethan said simply. Something in the reasonableness of that answer, The quiet, unapologetic reasonableness of a man who had nothing to defend and nothing to prove ignited something in Caleb that he would not be able to explain in the days that followed. What came next did not feel, in the moment, like a decision. It felt like physics, like the structural failure of something that had been under too much load for too long, finally reaching the precise configuration that exceeded its tolerance. He stepped forward and brought his boot down on the neck of the guitar. The sound it made was not musical. It was the sound of irreversible structural failure, wood fracturing under sudden catastrophic force. The neck separated from the body at the heel joint, the strings snapping with a discordant, diminishing shriek. The guitar body spun sideways off the stool and struck the sidewalk. Caleb, still operating on the precise motor control that 3 years of military training had wired into his nervous system, regardless of blood alcohol level, picked up the guitar body and brought it down against the edge of the open case once, hard. The body cracked along the grain with a report that seemed too large for the street, too large for the afternoon, too large for the life Ethan Caldwell had been quietly building on this corner for 11 years. Then it was quiet. Caleb stood in the wreckage, splinters of aged spruce and maple, a broken tuning peg, strings coiled like something defeated on the warm concrete. And the force that had driven him there drained away as completely and as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the raw, absolute clarity of what he had just done. Ethan had not moved. He sat on his stool with his hands open on his knees, looking at what remained of the 1967 Gibson J45 that 8 men had bought at a pawn shop outside Fort Campbell, Kentucky, in the spring of 1971. His face held nothing that could be described as anger. What it held was harder to look at than anger would have been. The sidewalk had frozen. 8, 10, 12 people had stopped, and phones were emerging with the automatic, almost reflexive efficiency of people who had learned that the correct response to witnessing something was to document it. Nobody moved toward Ethan. Nobody stepped into the space between the 2 men. A woman put her hand over her mouth. A man in a tourist t-shirt took a slow step backward, then another, the instinct for distance overriding the instinct for intervention. Linda Hayes, 42, on her way to the coffee shop on the next block, had gone completely still. She was holding her phone at her side without having decided not to raise it. She was watching the old man on the stool look at the pieces of his guitar, and she felt the particular shame of a bystander, the clear and unwelcome knowledge that you are witnessing something that requires action and providing only your presence. Nobody did anything. And then, from the parking lot a block east, there was movement. Not the tentative shuffle of 2 or 3 bystanders weighing their options, not the gradual gathering of a concerned crowd. The movement was collective and simultaneous. 160 men in leather and denim, rising from their bikes and their conversations in a single unified tide that had found its direction. Douglas Pierce, known to every member of the Flagstaff chapter as Doc, a name earned not from medical training but from his precise habit of diagnosing the nature of a situation before anyone else had finished reacting to it, had been standing beside his bike when the guitar broke. He had been mid-sentence, talking to Raymond Stokes about tomorrow morning's route. He had stopped at the first crack of wood. He watched for 3 full seconds. He assessed what he was seeing: an old man in an army jacket, a shattered guitar, a drunk man standing in the wreckage, and a sidewalk full of people with phones in their hands and their feet rooted to the pavement. Then he said quietly, to no one and to everyone around him, "Let's go." The crowd on LaRue Street had been expecting violence. This was understandable. The logic of the situation seemed to demand it. A drunk man had just destroyed a veteran's guitar on a public sidewalk, and now 160 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were moving toward that man in a single, coordinated body. Every person pressing back against the storefront glass, every person raising a phone, every person frozen on the sidewalk, with the instinct for self-preservation overriding everything else, was braced for the same outcome. The violence did not come. What came instead was a circle. They formed it with the quiet efficiency of men who had spent decades moving together in space, filling the sidewalk and spilling into the street in a ring that enclosed the broken guitar, the old man on his stool, and Caleb Morrow with a speed that left no room for negotiation or escape. They did not touch anyone. They did not raise their voices. They simply arrived, and they stood, and the intersection became very still. Caleb turned in place, and the full circumference of what surrounded him registered in stages, first the leather, then the patches, then the faces, then the sheer, unarguable number of them. His hands, hanging at his sides, came up slightly in the instinctive defensive preparation of a trained soldier, a gesture that had no practical application in this geometry. The math was not available for a response. 160 was not a number you fought. It was a number you stood inside of and waited to understand. For the first time in hours, possibly for the first time in months, his mind achieved the specific, terrible clarity that extreme fear can produce when every other coping mechanism has been bypassed. He waited for what he was certain was coming. Douglas Pierce walked through the circle without hurrying, the crowd parting for him the way it parts for someone whose authority requires no announcement. He was 55 years old, built with the solidity of a man who had spent a lifetime doing physical work, his grey beard trimmed close, and his eyes, the grey blue of winter slate over standing water, entirely calm. He wore his colours, the red and white patches of the Flagstaff chapter, the top rocker, the bottom rocker, 30 years of accumulated meaning stitched into cloth that most people read as a warning and almost no one read correctly. He did not look at Caleb first. He walked to Ethan and crouched slightly, bringing himself to the eye level of a man sitting on a camp stool. "Sir," he said. His voice was not loud. It carried without volume, the way certain voices do when they have spent years being listened to. "Are you hurt?" Ethan Caldwell looked at the man in front of him with the same unhurried assessment he had given to everything in his 68 years. He studied him for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm not hurt." "Is this yours?" Doc gestured at the wreckage on the sidewalk. "What's left of it," Ethan said. He reached down and picked up the broken neck, the mahogany still warm from his hands, the inlaid mother-of-pearl fret markers catching the afternoon light with an achingly decorative precision on a thing that was no longer functional. He held it the way you hold something that was once alive. "How long have you had it?" 53 years. Doc absorbed this. Not with visible emotion, but with the particular quality of attention that people who have learned to listen correctly bring to significant information. Receiving it fully, holding it, giving it its proper weight. Then he turned to Caleb. Caleb had not moved. He stood in the center of the circle with the posture of someone who had concluded at some foundational physiological level that stillness was the only coherent response available. A stillness that was not composure, but resembled it the way shock resembles calm. "What's your name?" Doc said. The question was simple. It was also, in its context, the kind of question that functions as a structure, something that requires the person to locate themselves, to confirm their own existence as a specific individual with a name and not merely as the author of an action. "Caleb," he said. A pause. "Morrow." Caleb Morrow. Doc stood at a conversational distance, neither advancing nor retreating, his body language encoding neither threat nor absolution. "Do you know what you just did?" Not rhetorical. A real question, requiring a real answer, and the circle of 160 men made the space for evasion structurally unavailable. "Yes," Caleb said. "Tell me." Caleb looked at the pieces of the guitar. The afternoon light had not changed. The sky was still the same deep, indifferent blue it had been when he walked out of the bar. "I broke his guitar," he said. "You broke a 53-year-old guitar belonging to a man who served in Vietnam." Doc's voice carried no heat. That absence of heat was, in some precise way, more severe than heat would have been. It meant that what was happening was not about anger. It was about something that required more of Caleb than anger would have. "Do you understand what that guitar was?" Caleb said nothing. From the outer edge of the circle, where the bystanders who had been on the sidewalk were now compressed against storefronts by the sheer presence of the ring of men, Linda Hayes had lowered her phone. She had been recording. She stopped. The act of recording seemed suddenly like exactly the wrong relationship to have to this moment. On his stool, Ethan sat with the broken neck across his knees and said nothing. He watched Caleb Morrow with an expression that, to Raymond Stokes standing 6 feet away at the inner edge of the circle, was not what you would expect from a man who had just been wronged. Stokes was 48 years old, had ridden with Doc for 19 years, and had developed over those years an acuity for the emotional temperature of situations that his exterior, large, weathered, the jaw of someone who had resolved disagreements the hard way more than once in his younger decades, did not advertise. What Ethan Caldwell felt when he looked at Caleb Morrow, Stokes thought, was not what a victim feels toward the person who harmed them. It was what a survivor feels when they recognize another one, because Caleb was coming apart. It happened slowly at first, and then all at once, the way most structural failures proceed. The alcohol was still in his system, but fear had metabolized its social utility, leaving behind the unmedicated substrate of everything he had been using it to cover. His hand went to his face. His breathing shifted. The rigidity that had been maintaining his upright posture began to fail, incrementally, like a wall losing its mortar. "I need," he started. He didn't finish. He didn't know what the sentence required. Officer Mike Brennan, 39, of the Flagstaff Police Department, had been 2 blocks north when the first call came in. Multiple callers reporting a disturbance on LaRue, large motorcycle club involved. And he had arrived to find a scene that matched no training protocol he had been prepared for. He stood at the perimeter of the circle with his right hand on his radio and conducted his assessment with the methodical care his department required of him. Nobody was fighting. No weapons were visible. 160 Hell's Angels were standing in a circle in the middle of a public street, and the situation read, against all reasonable expectation, as contained. He kept his hand on the radio. He did not key it. It was Doc who said it first, not as an accusation and not as a question designed to trap, but as the right question, delivered at the precise moment when the person it was aimed at had no more defenses remaining to deflect it. "When did you get back?" The circle was quiet. Traffic on Route 66 had stacked behind the blockage and settled into the patient idling of a Saturday afternoon that had accepted its disruption. Caleb Morrow stood in the center of that quiet, and the question arrived with the precision of a key in a lock, the specific combination of words that named the thing no one else had named in 8 months. He looked up from his hands. "What?" "When did you get back?" Doc said again, with the quiet patience of someone who is not asking because he doesn't already know the general shape of the answer. "From deployment." The word landed in Caleb's chest like a physical thing. His head pulled back slightly, the involuntary micro-recoil of someone who has heard the exact sentence they were not prepared to encounter. He looked at Doc. He looked at the men in the circle. He looked at his own hands, which were shaking in a way they had never shaken during 3 tours in Afghanistan, and which had just destroyed an irreplaceable thing, and which were the hands of a trained soldier who had received a Bronze Star for actions under extreme pressure. "November," he said, 8 months ago. Doc nodded, not in sympathy, in the specific recognition of someone who has stood at this particular intersection between deployment and its aftermath before. 3 tours, Caleb said. The information left him the way deeply pressurized things leave a sealed container when the seal fails, not gradually, but in a rush that had its own momentum. 3rd Infantry Division, Kandahar, then Helmand, then back to Kandahar, Staff Sergeant. He used the past tense without apparent notice. 2021, there was a firefight outside the wire east of Panjwai. 3 of my guys didn't come back. He stopped. Something crossed his face that existed below the vocabulary he had available for it. I did. I came home in November. The circle held its silence. My wife left in April. My daughter... His voice changed on the word, dropped into something more fundamental than the surrounding language. She's 4 years old. Her name is Lily. She has my eyes. He said it with the precision of someone for whom this fact was the most specific and important thing they possessed. I haven't seen her in 2 months. Doc did not move. He offered no hand on the shoulder, no softening of the moment, no verbal reassurance. What he offered was continued, complete attention, which was, in the particular economy of this situation, both more demanding and more respectful than comfort. The army sends you home, Caleb said. They give you pamphlets and a phone number and a final evaluation that says you performed with remarkable composure, and then you're just released. You're standing in Flagstaff, Arizona, and it's a Saturday morning, and you're buying a 6-pack at a gas station before the sun is up, because the other option is lying in your apartment, listening to the way your own breathing sounds at 3 a.m. And then it's 3:30 in the afternoon and you're standing in the middle of... He looked at the guitar pieces. His jaw tightened. I know that's not an explanation. I know what I did. And I know I don't get to ask you to understand it. He directed his eyes upward toward Ethan with visible effort. I'm sorry. Ethan Caldwell had not spoken since answering Doc's first questions. He sat with the broken neck of the J-45 across his knees and listened to Caleb Morrow describe his November, his April, the gas station before sunrise, the 2 months without his daughter, with the absolute attention of someone hearing something they already know the shape of, intimately, from the inside. He had come home in 1970. The details differed, the era differed. The specific geography of what broke him and what he broke in response was his own and not Caleb's. But the structure of it, the architecture of returning from somewhere you could not explain to people who had not been there, and finding that the distance between there and here was not something a flight home could close, was the same structure, the same load on the same type of material, producing the same kinds of failure. He knew exactly what Caleb Morrow was describing. How many of the men here have deployed? Ethan said to Doc. His voice was quiet and even. It was the first extended thing he had volunteered to the conversation, and the circle oriented toward it. Doc looked at him. Then he turned and raised his own voice just enough to carry. Veterans, he said. Show him. Hands went up, not all 160. But as Ethan turned slowly to look around the circumference of the circle, the count accumulated 41 hands. Men in their 50s and 60s who had gone to Vietnam, men in their 40s who had gone to the Gulf and to Iraq and to Afghanistan, men who wore the same leather and the same patches as the men beside them, and who had also, at some point in their lives, worn a different kind of uniform in a different kind of place. Caleb watched those hands rise, and something happened in his face that was not crying in any conventional sense, but was the thing that happens in the instant before a person is overtaken by something they have spent months outrunning. 41 hands. On a Saturday afternoon in Flagstaff, Arizona, standing in a circle around a drunk man and a broken guitar on Route 66. What was the guitar? Doc said, turning back to Ethan. And Ethan told him. He told it plainly, the way he had learned to tell things that mattered, without performance, without sentiment that was not earned. Charlie Company, the pawn shop outside Fort Campbell, the diner booth, the handwritten card in 8 different sets of handwriting, and what each of those signatures had meant, and what the subsequent 53 years had done to all but one of them. The circle was quiet for a moment after he finished that held wait. Then a man at the back of the circle, Gerald Whitfield, 61, Vietnam-era patches on his cut, 30 years of Flagstaff winters in his face, said quietly, "The 506th was at Dong Up Beer." "Before my rotation," Ethan said. "We were there in 69. Gerald nodded. A different kind of recognition passed between them across the full diameter of the circle, the compressed, wordless acknowledgement of people who share a geography of experience that most others can only approximate from the outside. Officer Brennan, at the perimeter of the scene, removed his hand from his radio entirely. He was 39 years old. His father had done 2 tours in Vietnam and had never, not once in Brennan's lifetime, talked about it in any way that made it accessible. He understood, somewhere below the level of policy and procedure, the precise nature of what he was watching. He stayed where he was. He did not move. Caleb was sitting on the sidewalk now. He had not decided to sit. His legs had made the decision unilaterally, and he had followed. He had his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he was doing what men who have spent years overriding every signal from their own nervous systems eventually do when the override mechanisms fail simultaneously. He was crying in a way that looked like he was trying to do something else entirely, some other activity that simply happened to involve the same muscles and the same sounds. Nobody gave an order. That was the detail that stayed with Linda Hayes in the weeks and months that followed, when she thought about that Saturday afternoon, which was often, and which she did without having decided to. Nobody organized what happened next, or announced it, or coordinated it. It arose the way certain things arise when enough people have understood something simultaneously, and the understanding finds its own natural form. Raymond Stokes reached into the breast pocket of his cut and produced a folded bandana, black fabric with a clean geometric pattern, the kind that every rider carries. He walked to where Caleb was sitting on the sidewalk and crouched beside him. He didn't speak immediately. He held the bandana out. After a moment, Caleb took it. Gerald Whitfield reached into the inner pocket of his leather jacket and produced a business card. He had been carrying this specific card for 2 years, since the evening his nephew, Marine Corps, 2 Iraq rotations, 29 years old, had called him from a parking lot in Prescott at 2 in the morning in a state that Gerald had recognized and had not, in that moment, known how to respond to correctly. After that call, he had found out where to send someone who called at 2 a.m. from a parking lot. He had written it down. He had kept it. A veterans support line, staffed around the clock by people who had served, talking to people who had served. Not a pamphlet, not a form. A voice on the other end that knew what a room filling with water looked like from the inside. He walked to Caleb and held the card out without a word. Caleb took it and looked at it for a long time. Doc Pierce had moved to stand near Ethan, and the 2 men had not spoken since the end of Ethan's account of Charlie Company, but the silence between them had the quality of a conversation already underway. "We want to replace it," Doc said. Ethan looked at him. "The guitar, whatever it takes." "You can't replace it," Ethan said. "Not with resentment, with the precision of a man stating a fact. It's been with me 53 years. 8 men bought it for me. There's no replacing what it was." "No," Doc agreed. He didn't try to reframe it or soften the accuracy of it. "There isn't. But a man who plays shouldn't be without a guitar." A pause. "Let us do what we can do." He turned to the circle. "Pass it," he said. What was passed was a riding helmet, a black bell belonging to Tony Marsh, chosen for its capacity. The helmet moved through the circle in a silence that was not awkward but purposeful, and men reached into their cuts and their back pockets with the matter-of-fact directness of people who have a clear task and no ambivalence about it. It took 6 minutes. When the helmet returned to Tony, he carried it to Doc, who set it on the sidewalk in front of Ethan. The visible mass of folded bills suggested a sum that would purchase more than a serviceable guitar. "That's not actually the point of this, though," Doc said. "No," Ethan said, "it's not." The point was the thing that neither of them articulated directly, because it was too large for direct statement on a sidewalk on a Saturday afternoon. It was the 50 years between the spring of 1971 and the fall of 2021. It was 41 raised hands and 3 tours, and a daughter named Lily with her father's eyes, and a card in a soldier's pocket from a man who had found out, 2 years too late, but not too late to matter, where to send someone who called at 2 a.m. from a parking lot. It was the specific American distance between going and coming back, and the insufficient bridges that had been built across it. Doc looked at where Caleb was still sitting on the sidewalk, Gerald's card in one hand, Ray's bandana in the other. "Get up," he said, not harshly, with the specific quality of someone who is making a distinction between allowing a person to stay down and requiring them to rise, 2 different acts, both of which can be dressed as compassion, but which have different long-term consequences. Caleb got up. It took effort. He stood. "Face him," Doc said. Caleb turned to Ethan Caldwell. They stood 3 feet apart. A 34-year-old man who had left for war and returned to a country that had moved on, and a 68-year-old man who had done the same thing 34 years earlier and had spent the time in between building something survivable out of whatever materials were available. The afternoon light had shifted into gold, the long late-day angle of July in the high desert, the kind of light that made everything on the street look temporarily significant. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. He said it the same way he had said it before, but differently, aimed now at a specific person, at a specific irreversible thing, without the surrounding noise of the circle's formation to absorb any of it. "I know the guitar was something I can't give back. I know that. And I know I don't have the right to ask you to understand what I'm going through, because you didn't do anything wrong. I just—" He stopped, started again. "I'm sorry." Ethan Caldwell looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I know what it looks like when the war doesn't end." He said it simply, without theatre, as a statement of observed fact. And the fact of it, the accuracy of it, the way it named with perfect precision the thing that Caleb had been unable to name in 8 months of trying, landed in the space between them and did something that could not be described in the vocabulary of what people ordinarily say to each other on sidewalks. Caleb's chest moved with a breath too large and too unsteady to qualify as normal breathing. "The number on that card Gerald gave you," Ethan said, "use it. Not tomorrow. Tonight." Caleb looked at the card in his hand. He nodded. "The girl with your eyes," Ethan said. "She's 4 years old. You've got time, Caleb." Caleb did not trust himself to speak. He nodded again, twice, and the nodding carried the weight of a man who has just been given something he did not know he needed, and does not yet know what to do with, but intends to find out. Officer Brennan stepped forward from the perimeter. He had received 2 more radio calls in the preceding 15 minutes and had responded to both with the same assessment. Situation contained, no assistance required. His sergeant would want a written explanation of that call. He was already composing it. He approached Ethan. "Sir, I'll need a statement regarding the property damage," he said. He looked at the helmet of bills. He looked at Caleb. He made his assessment. "The club is covering the damage," Doc said. "Is that acceptable to you, sir?" Brennan asked Ethan. Ethan picked up the helmet and held it for a moment with both hands. "My name is Ethan Caldwell," he said. "I have played the corner of LaRue Street and Route 66 every Saturday afternoon for 11 years. This Saturday has been better and worse than any of the others." He handed the helmet back to Tony Marsh, who received it with a nod. "Yes," he told Brennan, "it's acceptable." Brennan wrote something in his notebook. He was going to write a very unusual report later, and he was going to mean every word of it. The crowd had not dispersed. They had been standing through the entirety of it, the couple on their way to dinner, the tourists with their souvenir bags, Linda Hayes, who had not raised her phone in 20 minutes. Some of them had been crying without entirely noticing. Some of them had put their phones in their pockets and were simply present with the moment in the uncomplicated way that moments of this kind occasionally demand and very rarely receive. Linda Hayes, thinking about it later, would have difficulty explaining to the people she told the story to what exactly she had witnessed. The short version, the one that fit into 2 sentences and could be conveyed at a dinner table, was that a drunk man smashed a veteran's guitar and 160 Hells Angels held him accountable. That version was factually accurate and almost entirely insufficient. The longer version was something about the architecture of judgment, about the way the people you have decided to fear sometimes turn out to be the ones building the circle, about the way the person you have dismissed as a threat might be drowning in plain sight, close enough to reach, about the old man on the corner who you walk past every single week and do not see, who is carrying something most people in the world will never be asked to carry. The longer version was the one that stayed. Hank Fuller, 63, had been in the circle the whole time without speaking. A harmonica player since boyhood, a Vietnam veteran since 1969, a Hells Angel since 1981. He reached into a saddlebag on his bike, which was close enough to the sidewalk that he didn't need to go far, and produced a Marine Band harmonica in G major. He didn't announce this. He put it to his lips and played 8 bars of something slow and measured, a melody that might have been a song Linda didn't know, or something he was constructing in real time, or both simultaneously. Ethan Caldwell listened to those 8 bars with his eyes closed. Then he reached into the guitar case and found, among the wreckage, a single tuning peg still attached to a small fragment of the headstock, intact, the mother-of-pearl button unbroken. He held it in his palm for a moment, then placed it in his breast pocket. "Hank," he said. Hank looked up. "What key are you in?" "G," said Hank. Ethan stood up from the stool for the first time since the afternoon began. 68 years old, knees that had filed their complaints, back that remembered every altitude it had ever slept at. He picked up the guitar case, lighter now, and wrong in its lightness, and folded the stool under his arm. "I'll see you next Saturday," he said to Hank. "Bring that thing." Hank Fuller smiled. It was the smile of a man who had not expected this particular Saturday to give him anything, and who had just been surprised. Doc walked beside Ethan toward the edge of the parking lot. Behind them, Ray and Gerald and Tony were quietly managing the logistics of departure. The helmet returned to its owner, the money counted and placed in an envelope that Tony had produced from somewhere with the organizational efficiency of a man who prepared for most contingencies. "It won't be the same guitar," Ethan said. "No," Doc said. "It won't be." They stood for a moment at the lot entrance. Route 66 ran past them with the patient continuity of a road that has outlasted every argument about what matters and what doesn't. "My son served," Doc said. 2 tours in Iraq. He was 24 when he came home. A pause, brief and deliberate. "He's 41 now. He plays bass in a band out of Phoenix. Terrible band." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "He's happy." Ethan understood what this was, the particular gift of a man saying, "I know the exact distance between the worst possible version of this and the version where a person ends up in a terrible band being happy. I know it is crossable. Thank you, Ethan said. Doc extended his hand. Ethan shook it, and the handshake had the firmness of two men who have arrived at a mutual understanding that required no elaboration. On the sidewalk, Caleb Morrow was still standing. Ray and Gerald had given him space without moving far, the particular kind of presence that is neither abandonment nor intrusion. Caleb was looking at Gerald's business card with the focused attention of a man who has decided that the object in his hand is the most important thing currently in his possession. Ethan stopped beside him on the way past. "Caleb," he said. Caleb looked up. "Tonight," Ethan said. "Not tomorrow." Something had shifted in his face. The specific change of a person who has been accurately seen for the first time in a long time by someone with the experience to see correctly. It was not resolution. It was not recovery. It was 1 degree of turn on a compass that had been spinning freely for 8 months, the first small orientation toward something fixed. It was, for right now, enough to start with. Ethan Caldwell walked to his truck, parked 3 blocks east on the far side of the lot. The afternoon had moved fully into its golden hour, the long horizontal light of late July washing the ponderosa pines on the ridge above town in a color that had no name in any paint catalogue. He placed the lighter-than-it-should-be guitar case in the truck bed and sat for a moment in the cab with the engine off, his hand in his breast pocket around the single intact tuning peg. Then he started the truck and drove home on Route 66 for 4 blocks before the road turned, and he turned with it, the way he always did, and the intersection of LaRue Street disappeared behind him. Behind him, the 160 men of the Hells Angels Flagstaff chapter mounted their bikes one by one, the engines coming alive in sequence with the low, accumulating thunder of mass departure, a sound that had been frightening the uninitiated since 1948, and which was, on this particular Saturday in Flagstaff, Arizona, the sound of men going home after doing what they came to do. They pulled out onto Route 66, heading north, toward the mountain, and were gone. The intersection returned to its ordinary Saturday self, traffic moving, tourists walking, the Rusty Spur Saloon emitting its steady afternoon soundtrack through a propped open door. The only evidence that anything had happened was a scattering of fine wood splinters at the edge of the curb, catching the last of the afternoon light, too small to be noticed by anyone who had not been there to see what they had been part of. And on the sidewalk, a man named Caleb Morrow stood alone for the first time in hours with a business card in his hand, a borrowed bandana folded in his pocket, and his daughter's name inside his chest like something that had just been returned to him. He looked at the card. He looked at the number. He pressed call.